The little girl pressed her tiny hand against the cold car window and suddenly stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, beneath a flickering street lamp in downtown Chicago, a homeless mother was sitting on the frozen pavement, desperately wrapping her thin coat around a newborn baby whose tiny cries were becoming weaker. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the mother had nothing left to protect her child except her own trembling body. Then the little girl turned toward her father with tears filling her eyes and whispered the words that would change 3 lives forever. "Daddy, her baby is freezing." Ethan Carter, a 38-year-old single father and successful technology CEO, had spent years believing that money could solve almost every problem. He owned a luxury apartment overlooking Chicago, drove an expensive black SUV, and had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But sitting beside him in the back seat was his 7-year-old daughter, Grace, who had inherited none of his emotional walls. Where Ethan saw strangers, Grace saw people. Where he saw a dangerous winter night, she saw a mother trying desperately to keep her baby alive. If you believe kindness and second chances can change someone's life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose heart might need a reminder that compassion still exists. Ethan had been driving home with Grace after attending a company charity dinner. The event had been filled with wealthy executives wearing designer suits and discussing donations, tax deductions, and business partnerships. Ethan had donated a large amount of money that evening, but somehow Grace had not been impressed. She had spent most of the dinner asking why the people serving food did not sit down and eat with everyone else. Ethan had smiled at her questions, but deep inside, he had wondered when his daughter had become so much more aware of the world than he was. As their SUV approached a quiet intersection, Grace noticed movement near a closed bus shelter. She leaned closer to the window and saw a woman sitting on the ground. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s. Her name was Hannah Brooks, though Ethan would not learn that for several minutes. Hannah's dark brown hair was tangled beneath a worn gray knitted hat, and her face was pale from exhaustion. In her arms was her 3-month-old daughter, Rose, wrapped in a thin blanket that had become damp from the cold pavement. Grace's voice trembled when she told her father that the baby was freezing. Ethan looked toward the shelter and immediately noticed the woman's lips moving as she tried to comfort the infant. Something inside him changed. He pulled the SUV to the curb and stepped out. Hannah immediately looked frightened. She had learned to be suspicious of strangers because homelessness had taught her that kindness sometimes came with conditions. She tightened her arms around Rose and tried to stand, but her legs shook beneath her. Ethan slowly approached without making any sudden movements. He told her he was not there to cause trouble and asked if the baby was breathing normally. Hannah nodded, although tears were already running down her cheeks. She explained that she had lost her apartment 2 months earlier after losing her job at a restaurant. The little savings she had were spent on diapers, formula, and medicine after Rose became sick. A temporary shelter had turned her away earlier that evening because there were no beds available. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He looked at Rose, whose tiny face was almost completely hidden beneath the blanket. He remembered something from years earlier, something he rarely allowed himself to think about. His own wife, Rachel, had died shortly after Grace was born. Ethan had buried himself in work because he believed success would protect his daughter from pain. But watching Hannah hold her baby with the same desperate determination he had once felt in a hospital room made him realize that some wounds never truly disappear. Grace stepped out of the SUV holding her pink winter coat. Before Ethan could stop her, she walked toward Hannah and placed the coat gently over Rose. Hannah stared at the little girl in disbelief. Grace simply told her that babies should be warm. That innocent gesture broke something inside Hannah. She lowered her head and began crying. Ethan immediately called his driver and asked him to bring blankets and a portable heater from the SUV. He also contacted emergency medical services to check Rose. Hannah tried to refuse, terrified that accepting help would somehow cost her custody of her child. Ethan reassured her that getting medical attention was not a weakness, and that no one was going to take Rose away simply because she needed help. When the paramedics arrived, Rose was carefully examined. She was suffering from dangerous cold exposure and needed immediate warmth and observation. Hannah climbed into the ambulance with her, but before the doors closed, she looked at Ethan with an expression filled with shame and gratitude. She told him she had not always lived on the streets. She had once worked hard, paid her bills, and dreamed of opening a small bakery. One unexpected job loss, followed by medical expenses and a broken lease, had pushed her into a situation she never imagined possible. Ethan stood silently as he listened. For the first time in years, he realized how easily a person could fall from stability into desperation. He had always assumed people needed better decisions. That night, he understood that sometimes people simply needed someone to catch them before they hit the ground. At the hospital, doctors warmed Rose and monitored her closely. Hannah sat beside the crib, refusing to leave her daughter's side. Ethan and Grace waited down the hallway. Grace eventually fell asleep against her father's shoulder. Ethan looked at his daughter and wondered what kind of man he wanted her to remember when she became an adult. A wealthy man who gave money to charities from a distance, or a father who stopped when someone was freezing on the sidewalk. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He did not simply hand Hannah a check. Instead, he arranged for a safe temporary apartment, paid the first several months of rent, contacted a local employment counselor, and asked his company's community outreach team to help Hannah rebuild her life. He also funded a small emergency program for struggling mothers who were only one crisis away from homelessness. But Hannah did not want to live on charity forever. She wanted to work. A week later, Ethan learned about her dream of opening a bakery. He offered her a position managing the kitchen at a small cafe owned by one of his company's partners. It was not a handout. It was a chance. Months passed. Hannah worked hard. She arrived early, stayed late, and slowly regained her confidence. Rose grew healthier and stronger. Grace visited often, bringing drawings and small stuffed animals for the baby. The friendship between Grace and Hannah became one of the most unexpected gifts Ethan had ever received. Then one snowy morning, almost a year after the night outside the bus shelter, Ethan received an invitation. Hannah had finally opened her own small bakery in a renovated storefront on a quiet Chicago neighborhood street. Above the entrance was a simple wooden sign that read, "Rose's Corner." Ethan walked inside with Grace holding his hand. The bakery smelled like fresh bread and cinnamon. Hannah stood behind the counter, smiling through tears. Rose, now a healthy toddler, toddled across the floor toward Grace. Hannah told Ethan she had spent months wondering why a wealthy stranger had stopped for her when hundreds of other cars had passed that night. Ethan looked at Grace and said the truth was that he had almost driven past too. It was his daughter who had noticed. Grace smiled and hugged Hannah. Ethan realized then that the greatest thing he had given Hannah was not money, an apartment, or a job. It was the simple message that she and her child still mattered. Sometimes saving someone does not require extraordinary power. Sometimes it only requires noticing the person everyone else has chosen to ignore. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe so more stories of hope can reach people who need them. Your engagement may seem small, but it helps stories like this find more hearts. And before the story ends, I have one special request. Comment, "Kindness still matters." If you believe one small act of compassion can change a life. That freezing Chicago night changed Ethan, Grace, Hannah, and Rose forever. But perhaps its greatest lesson was something much simpler. A person does not always need someone to rescue them. Sometimes they only need someone to stop, look them in the eyes, and remind them that they have not been forgotten. Because while the world may sometimes pass by without noticing, kindness has a way of stopping exactly where hope is about to disappear.